In 1943, a group of high society anti-Nazis from Germany met together to discuss ways in which they could defy the Nazi regime and rebuild Germany. What they didn't know is that at that meeting, there was a spy, someone who would betray them all. In Jonathan Freedland's new book, The Traitors Circle, he tells this unknown story of those within the Nazi regime that chose to give up everything to defy and disrupt Hitler's plans. Why? Well, it's not as clear-cut as you could imagine. In fact, most of these anti-Nazis could have stayed silent, looked the other way, and remained comfortable in their high society lives until the war was over. But they didn't. In my conversation with Jonathan Freedland, we talked about what or who could convince a group of men and women who did not need to give up their lives to sacrifice for the ultimate good of not only Germany, but the world. I hope you enjoy. I'm here with Jonathan Freedland, and I'm excited for this episode. We're going to be talking about his book, The Traitors Circle, which is a fascinating story set in World War II. It's true events, and the center part of the story, or I feel like what the story kind of digs deeply into, is fascinating. And I want to get into all of that. But before we get started, maybe Jonathan, would you just tell people a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, that sort of thing?
Sure, with pleasure. And it's very good to be with you, Andy. I'm a journalist. I live in London, England. I'm speaking to you tonight it's tonight for me, the afternoon for you, but in London. I've been writing a column, an editorial page opinion column for the Guardian newspaper for a long, long time. I've learned not to advertise because then people think you're too old to be doing it much longer, but decades. Yeah. I also have had for a long time, a podcasting career as well. I produce a podcast called Unholy. Subtitle is Two Jews on the News. It's me and an Israeli journalist, the woman who is the anchor of the nightly TV news in Israel, Yonit Levy. She and I present that podcast each week. We've been doing it for 5 years. I have a second podcast for the Guardian called Politics Weekly America, because covering American politics was really how I got into. I mean, it was almost the first big job I had in journalism. I was the Washington correspondent for the Guardian back in the 1990s. Wow. And so covering American politics is something I've done really throughout. And so each of those two podcasts reflects different passions of mine. I've reported on Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the decades. That's covered in the Unholy podcast, and then American politics with that Guardian one. But the other string to sort of this particular bow that maybe is relevant is I have had over for a while, this whole other life as a writer of thrillers under a different name. I wrote thrillers under the name Sam Bourne. Long story why a different name, but there we are. And what I have moved into in the last few years is something which brings together these two areas of my life. So I've written now 2 books of nonfiction under my own, as it were, journalist name, Jonathan Freedland, my own name. Mm-hmm. But they draw on, in terms of the style and the form, they draw on the sort of thriller experience I garnered writing those novels. And so this new book, The Traitors Circle, like the one before it, which was called The Escape Artist, tells a completely true historical story, documented. There's 50 pages of footnotes with all the historical sources. There's nothing in it that's made up. But the challenge I set myself was to write it as if it was a page-turning thriller with suspense and, characters. And so, I know you're going to respect this. The book is done as a whodunit. We won't give any spoilers away, because I want people to read it as if it's a sort of, almost like an Agatha Christie murder mystery. We'll come to explain what the whodunit is. But those are the sort of two halves of my professional life that in the last 4 or 5 years have kind of come together.
And I feel like it's such an important an important book because right now, at least in the United States, I don't know what's happening over in the UK, but people are beginning to question the narrative of World War II, of who was the good guy, who was the bad guy, or who were the good guys, who were the bad guys. Was
Right.
Winston Churchill good? Was Hitler bad? Which I think is just shows how morally blind and we are as a culture right now, because I don't think that that's a very difficult question to answer, but a lot of people are having a hard time with it. And then even the war in Israel right now, there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of Jew hatred, to be completely honest with you, on the political right and on the political left in the United States. And so my first question for you was going to be like, I was confused reading the book, like, why was Hitler the bad guy? but that is like Tucker Carlson, a lot of these people who are bringing these questions up. Did that have anything to do with you writing this book, or did you start this even before all of that?
So it's an interesting question. First of all, I agree about there being a really troubling rise in anti-Semitism. It's really visible around the world. And you're absolutely right the way you framed it, which is to say on both the right and left. I think that's exactly right. And this change, this revisionism of the Second World War is something which you're hearing much more loudly on the right. And so you mentioned Tucker Carlson, who platformed a so-called historian who is sort of upending, right and wrong, day and night, black and white in that story, and trying to suggest that the villain of the story is exactly as you said, is Churchill, with Hitler as a sort of misunderstood figure. It's really alarming, and I think partly for something which I'm just going to intuit just from listening to you, a view that we both share, which is the Second World War is unusual because it's not just history, it's also moral. It's a morality story.
Absolutely.
And the reason why writers like me keep coming back to it is it has a moral dimension and acts as a kind of moral instruction. It is in some ways, the last clear-cut case of good versus evil in historical terms. You wouldn't say to someone, in order to find out something of their character, if you had been living through the Korean War, what would you have done? It wouldn't be a morally sort of clarifying example, because people would say, well, it depends. What do you mean? But if you say the Second World War, what would you have done? People immediately know what you mean. In the face of tyranny and murderous evil, the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews as the paradigm case, but all kinds of evil. What would you have done? People mean, okay, confronted with evil and tyranny, what do you do? It's not, people are not going to, they didn't used to argue the actual terms of the example. They just got into the philosophical conundrum.
Right.
Now, for the reasons you've said, that confidence, that sort of fixed point in our moral universe, there is an attempt to shift it.
Yes. Yeah. It's actually very scary, because I've talked to many, I mean, even people in my own family, that when I ask them we talk about World War II. So for instance, I have a great grandfather who fought in World War II, and in the family, they did an interview with him that only we have access to, and asked him about all the stories of World War II. It's very fascinating. And one of the family members has a lot of the, my great grandfather, I think it's great grandfather's, the things that he had gotten during the war. And so a couple of months ago, we went to this person's house and we were looking through these bins of, he took some Nazi stuff, like a flag and things like that, and these old actual Nazi flags and guns, and very fascinating. He had a copy of a propaganda piece of Hitler, and like, but we got into these conversations about World War II, the morality of World War II, and whether or not we could, can you say that what the Germans were doing was objectively evil? And it kept coming back in this conversation with a particular family member that, well, they thought that what they were doing was good. And so from their perspective, it was good. And I've heard that from young people as well, this postmodern, hey, it's from their perspective, it's good. Who am I to say that what they're doing is wrong? And it's like, does the millions of deaths not have anything? Does that not have anything to do with you deciding whether or not something's good or bad? And it's horrifying. Like, have you experienced that? Has that happened in your life where you're talking to people and they're like, well, from their perspective, it might not have been bad?
I would say I've certainly encountered that, as you rightly say, postmodern attitude, and you hear it when people talk about my truth, a
Yeah.
phrase that brings me out in hives. There is the truth, and there
Right.
is there is things that are false. And the
Mm.
minute somebody says my truth, or they're speaking their truth, my hackles rise, because I think, well, we're into moral and cultural relativism, which is a problem. I have not heard people try and make that case about the Nazi case,
Sure.
because that stands apart. It always has done. As the case no one can argue. The idea of murdering 6 million people, Jews,
Yes.
because of who they are, to the point of finding children and babies and so on.
Yeah.
It's been a sort of point of consensus for 80 years that that's obviously bad, and then the arguments are about how do you oppose it and what do you do, and certainly analytically, why did the people involved do it, why did they go along with it? But until almost the very recent period we're talking about, with Tucker Carlson platforming this author, it wasn't acceptable in sort of polite company to question the actual evil of it. And so never, underneath the thing you said, the conversation with your family member, there's quite an interesting almost anthropological question, which is rather than a moral or philosophical one, which is, when people do evil things but think they're good, why does that happen? Is it essential that people who do evil acts think they're good? Because would they not be able to do them if they thought they were bad? Did the Nazis at the time think they were all the villains in the movie? There's a meme of some character in a Nazi uniform, an actor in a Nazi uniform, going, hang on, does this mean we're the bad guys?
Right.
Because, that's interesting. As I say, almost sociologically or anthropologically, did the commandant of Auschwitz, the character who is depicted in The Zone of Interest, which is a very interesting film, did he think he was doing good or evil? I think they probably thought they were doing good, and that was probably, from some of them anyway, essential for them to do the business they were engaged in. It doesn't have any bearing on whether what they did was good or not. What they did was a bad and evil. The fact that they thought it was good is of interest, but it's not determinative in any way of the sort of moral complexion of what they did. And so I think people have lost their moorings a bit if they think that even enters into the discussion. I mean, Jeffrey Dahmer, did he think he was doing good? But maybe. That's quite interesting. If you're profiling a serial killer and want to know their psychology, it doesn't mean the serial killing was okay. It doesn't at all.
Right. And if you don't have any reference point for, just generally speaking, what is good and what is evil objectively, or whatever, however you want to say it, if you don't have any reference point, then I just feel like you can become susceptible to becoming, like, I feel like there's a rising, as we've just talked about in the United States especially, a rising tide of people who are in favor of maybe not in favor of the Nazis, although there are a lot of self-proclaimed, like, hey, we don't think that what they did was actually that bad. But just people who are very easily susceptible to that sort of totalitarian regime, because things seem to be unstable in the West, and they want a king. It's kind of like in the Bible, the Israelites, they want a king, and God's like, I'm your king. And they're like, no, we want a man king. And that's what they get, but it goes terribly wrong after a while. Are you seeing?
Well, I was just going to say, in your own country at the moment, that appetite for that is noticeable. I mean, there's this character Curtis Yarvin on the right who calls himself a neo-monarchist. There are people who talk about democracy having sort of run its course, and that is alarming. And I think you're right to see it in it a kind of timeless or ancient human impulse, which does go back to the biblical period, absolutely. And it's something that we, I think, need to be on guard against. That urge to rewrite history in that way, I think, has played some part I mean, as encountering that urge, has played some part in my turning to these two subjects. You know,
Right.
The Escape Artist, which was I published that book was published in 2022. It told the story of one of only a handful of Jewish prisoners of Auschwitz ever to escape.
Wow.
It's an extraordinary story. He was a teenage boy. He was 19. He escaped, and he escaped with purpose, which was to warn the world
Wow.
of what was happening in Auschwitz, which was then all but unknown.
Hmm.
This book, The Traitors Circle, in a nutshell, just in a sentence, is about a group of very aristocratic elite Germans, people who were from the top drawer of German society, who were all one way or another engaged in defying or resisting the Third Reich and Adolf Hitler, who gathered for a secret meeting, a tea party as it happened, on the 10th of September 1943, thinking they were among their own. And what they did not know is that sitting around the table with them was someone who they thought was a kindred spirit, a fellow anti-Nazi, but who was instead about to betray them all to the Gestapo. And both stories, well, for one thing, which I hope is of great interest to listeners to this podcast, these stories turn on moral drives and in some cases with the characters in this second book, religious impulses.
Yeah.
But they also chart history that is, especially in the first case, under assault in some way. There are people who want to deny the veracity of these events, and therefore, you know, I mentioned right at the beginning that I really want these books to be as rigorous as any non-fiction or history books. That's partly, again, my own feeling that you cannot take on the deniers unless you can say nothing in here is made up. It's documented, rigorously sourced, and so on. That's really important to me because there are people around there who want to deny that these events ever happened.
So you brought up the fact that the people in this book are wealthy people, and you do a really good job at the beginning of the book to, you know, just introduce these characters and explain who they are and where they come from. And it's like a world that I've never experienced in my life. They're living in like castles, and they have like servants and maids and things like that. And I don't know that world personally, but that is all to say, do you have this idea? I think a lot of people have this idea of rich people. They can kind of move past atrocities and things like that. Money kind of creates this security and comfort around them, and they don't have to deal with the real problems of the world. And these people actually chose to engage with the real problems of the world. Because I heard in a different interview that you did that they certainly could have gone through the war unscathed and not had to have dealt with all of the terrible things of the war, and they chose not to do that. So why did that? What is that? Why did they do that?
I mean, you've put your finger on what is the driving question of this book, and indeed of my own interest beyond even the boundaries of this book. I think it's a fascinating question. Why on earth would people do needless, above and beyond anything that's required of them, radical, extreme, dangerous good? You know, a lot of writers and journalists are very drawn to extreme acts of evil. You know, people who are, well, we talked about serial killers. You know, there are people who write true crime stories and who, or war correspondents in a way, are very drawn to seeing human beings at their most extreme and at their worst. I have, for a long time, been conversely perplexed or intrigued, puzzled by people who do the opposite, people who do good they didn't have to do. And in a way, this group, maybe this was why it leapt out to me when I sort of came across their story, is, as you said, several of them, you know, from the landed, richest echelon of society. Some of the others are not themselves personally rich. They are from aristocratic families where, you know, they may have run out of money. They were denied an inheritance and so on. Some of them just have that sort of status. They're in kind of Berlin high society. But yes, this is the world of embassy balls and nights at the opera and white tie dinners. And they go to restaurants where lobsters and champagne are served, even in the midst of rationing and the war. they all, this is what makes them so intriguing. They could have, as you said, they could have gone through the war unscathed. No one was coming after them.
Right.
There's one of these characters who has a tenuous Jewish link, but otherwise they're not Jews, they're not socialists or communists who were marked out as suspects. So why did they do it? And what I discovered about several, or rather, what I discovered about almost all of them, is they have a belief that they will somehow be judged by an authority higher than the secular government of the day. That, yes, of course, like anyone else, they're frightened of the Gestapo and the SS and Adolf Hitler's henchmen, as it were, enforcers knocking on the door in the dead of night and the horrors that will bring. Of course they are. But unlike a lot of other people, what they think is, in some ultimate sense, when they have to fully account for their lives, they will be judged by an authority higher than Adolf Hitler. Now, for some of them, intriguingly, it's about almost their own family, their own class. They are from families that have been lords and ladies of the manor for 1,000 years, centuries, and they think their ancestors will judge them. Were you worthy of the name of von Maltzan? That's one of the. There are two countesses in the story, not one. There are two, and one of them is from the von Maltzan family, and she is feels herself. She has a portrait of her father, an aristocrat, on the wall, and she feels that I've got to be able to look him in the eye and think, did I do right by this inheritance? That's 2 or 3 of them are like that. But the ones that interest me as much, and this is candidly one reason why I really wanted to come and speak with you on your podcast, the higher authority they have in mind is Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That's who they think will judge them. At least 2 of these people this is a group of people whose defiance and willingness to resist the regime will lead to a very ultimate place. I mean, I'm not going to say who, but it leads to the execution chamber for some of the people in this story, the hangman's rope and the guillotine.
Right.
Those people embark on that course because they think they will one day have to come face to face with the Almighty, and they will be judged. Did you do the right thing? And it doesn't matter if Adolf Hitler or the Gestapo or the SS judge them one way or the other. What really matters is, can they, as it were, look God in the eye and be judged that way? And I think that is what gives them the strength to embark on a course that can only bring, as it were, in this life, ruin and harm and suffering. They persist because they are answerable to an authority higher than the regime which is tormenting them.
As you're talking, I'm just thinking of one word, and that I think encapsulates that. Which is something that people don't talk about anymore. Really, is conviction. And I think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He had the opportunity to leave Germany, go to the United States. They had put together in the United States kind of like a teaching tour to go to all these different seminaries and get away from the war, basically. And so he goes to America and steps off the boat and is in New York. And immediately, he writes in his journal, he immediately felt convicted that he's not in the right place. He was going to be there. He was going to get away from the war. He was going to live. I mean, he would have been there for the war, and then when it ended, he would have gone back home.
Yeah.
And he immediately felt convicted. He felt like God was like, "This isn't where I have you." It's kind of like Jonah in Nineveh. It's like, you're supposed to go here, and you've gone the opposite direction. You got to go back. And he went back, and ultimately that led to they hanged him, and even before they killed him, he had the opportunity because one of the guards was going to let him out. And it was like a couple weeks before the war was over. And he chose to stay because he felt it was his responsibility. These are the most fascinating heroes in human history, in my opinion, because they have this deep conviction. And I think of the West today. We don't even discuss conviction anymore. And that was a central, that the conviction maybe was at the center of the Allies and what they did and why they risked everything to fight the Nazi regime, which was like a devastatingly horrid regime and very powerful. Anyways, that's just interesting, like the conviction of it. So like, I guess, yeah, why have we lost that today? And why did they have that conviction back then? Like you said, they felt like God was watching them.
Well, it's so interesting you mentioned this this instance of Bonhoeffer, who actually does make an appearance in this story in two or three places, because the two characters who I've mentioned to you without naming them, who are of deep Christian faith, both and separately have the opportunity to leave, to get out of Germany, and both refuse to take it, because in exactly the same way, they feel their duty is to be there where there is a chance of turning things around. Turning things around puts it too strongly. There's a chance of making a slight impact for the better. And it's funny, while we were speaking, I just wanted to look, and I did a little word search on the manuscript of my book, and the word conviction appears at least 15 times.
Good.
You're right to say it's a word we don't hear that often. When I was distinguishing the Christians in this book who aren't just Christian by birth, as it were, the word I use in my own mind, and I think I do in the book, is I describe them as conviction Christians. They are people who are animated and led by their faith. They're not just people who trot along to churches because, for family carol services or whatever. There are people like that in the book too.
Right.
It is determinative of their lives. They have the chance to leave. They do not take it. They feel it is their duty. And they also feel that they will be abandoning others who they could in some small way help. So there's one of the characters who she is given the opportunity to leave. She realizes that if she does so, it will put a light of suspicion on her brother. One of the interesting things about the Germany of this period, Nazi Germany, was the notion of blood guilt. That if you, Andy, were arrested, the authorities would not hesitate to arrest your wife or sisters or brothers as well, partly as leverage, but partly there was almost a doctrine that guilt was somehow through the blood. It was part, as I say, partly just pressure, but it was also a notion that all of you must be tainted by whatever sin it is that you are guilty of. Sippenhaft, they called it, this sort of blood guilt. So she knew that if she left, she would be essentially confirming her own guilt in the eyes of the authorities. Why else would she leave? And then that would indict her own brother. And by the way, her brother, like her, they were both in an organization called the Confessing Church. I don't know how well known this is, but there was a sort of dissident church in Germany. Yes. And they broke away from the German church in this period. It was unofficial. It was not allowed.
Yes.
They broke away partly because of a change that Adolf Hitler was driving through, which was there was the official German church, which he administratively sought to not abolish or eradicate, but to take over.
Yes.
And the functional head of the German church was going to be one Adolf Hitler. And a lot of clerics and clergy and others went along with this. But there were others who said, the head of the church is not Adolf Hitler. The head of the church is Jesus Christ. And they broke off and formed their Confessing Church.
And the reality there too, like, is to the extent that Hitler wanted to take over the church was that they were taking the crosses down in the church and putting swastikas up in place of them. And so it was like far beyond anything. It wasn't just some small little like, hey, I'm just in charge of the church, but you can keep doing what you're doing. It's like, no, we're changing the central doctrines. Like everything changes. It's all built around the regime. And if you don't obey the regime, then you're out. And Bonhoeffer was part of the Confessing Church kind of breaking away, and people were really angry with him because he just didn't go along to get along. But one thing that you said about conviction, it made me think of these people staying in Germany. It reminds me of I know I'm connecting a lot of this to the Bible, whatever, but Sodom and Gomorrah. So in the Old Testament, you have Sodom and Gomorrah, this terrible city, and God is going to just destroy it. And I believe it's Abraham
Yes.
who is negotiating with God. Well, how about if there's like 40 good people? What about
Yes.
30, 20? And he keeps going down there negotiating.
Gets to 10, doesn't he?
It gets to 10, yeah. And it's like a weird thing because you're thinking, man, I just read the description of what these people are doing in Sodom and Gomorrah is not good. Why are you negotiating on behalf of them, Abraham? Just let them be wiped out, you know? And Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot. He says part of the purpose of that story, or the meaning of that story, is that even one person in a really wicked city can change everything. Like the truth outbalances evil, even if it doesn't seem like it's as big or if there's not as many people who believe in the truth. And that is something that I don't think, it's something that I feel like when I read or watch movies about World War II or read about World War II, these men who, even in the United States, go across the ocean and go and leave their families, and a lot of them die. And you ask yourself, like, how on earth can you even do that? Whatever that was, that conviction or whatever it is, whatever words we could use to describe that was what was driving them. And it's very difficult to figure out how you can obtain that. I don't know how you obtain that, and I don't know how these people in your book obtain that, because I literally don't know, because I've been thinking about this for a couple of years, because in the United States, the church is not doing too well, in my opinion. And a lot of people that I know in the church have kind of gone along to get along, when a lot of the doctrines have been taken over on very obvious things. And I've wondered, man, how could people just sit around and do nothing about this? And then on the other side of that, what does it actually mean to be a Christian? If it means that you just tell people that you're a Christian, but you don't do anything that the Bible says, is that actually what a Christian is? Or is there something deeper? And the only thing that I could find is that the only distinguishing factor between non-Christians and Christians is conviction, is that they're just going to do the right thing when the moment comes, and they're going to say the truth, and they're going to take on whatever that means for them, whatever bad thing is going to come their way because they tell the truth, they're going to voluntarily take that on. That's the only differentiating factor that I've been able to figure out and find. And it feels like these people have that. And I don't know how you obtain that other than when the moment comes, you have to figure out what you're made of. Does that make sense?
It does make so much sense. And by the way, I found it fascinating. The two biblical examples you've mentioned are the Abraham and Sodom story and Jonah, because they're very similar stories in a way, which is a town that's condemned, Nineveh in one, Sodom in the other. And then he designates a sort of prophet to warn them and so on. And Abraham argues the point, and Jonah obviously famously runs away. But it's just really interesting because, I've told you I'm Jewish, and we read the book of Jonah on Yom Kippur on the Day of Atonement, the most solemn day of the year. And and Jonah is such a fascinating character because he knows what his duty is and flees from it because he fears that God in the end will relent. And it's so interesting, the idea that, I know you're getting me to do this, but in the end you're going to buckle because you always do, sort of thing. It's just such an interesting idea. But to your question about what is it that, the moment comes, what is it that takes it? In this case, and what so fascinates me about these people in this book, and I've come to sort of feel I really know them, this group of people who sat around that table on that fateful afternoon, is they did not come to it in one moment or, suddenly or instantly. Some did, but for others, it's gradual. The sort of penny drops, the scales fall from their eyes. In a way that I think my younger self might have been quite judgmental. How did you not see straight away? You went along with this terrible thing. I now think this is, they did not have the one thing we've got, which is hindsight. Yeah. We know it is the actual Nazis, the Third Reich. They, in 1933, think here's this new political party called the Nazis. They don't have the knowledge of Auschwitz and the Holocaust in their heads at that point. So, we demand a lot of them, that we expect them to see straight away exactly the full scale of this thing. For several of them, it happened at different moments. And it's, in some cases, it was gradual. And the key thing is, what I have such great respect for is if they understood sometimes without there being a key moment. I think a lot of us think there's going to be the moment where we know it's about to be a tyranny. that the tyrant will say, today, everyone, I'm declaring myself a tyrant and a dictator. So if you're going to resist, 12 noon is when you need to decide. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
You have to intuit it yourself. And what is really impressive about these people is they get it pretty early. I mean, the Tea Party itself is in 1943, but many of them have been engaged in acts of defiance or resistance for 10 years by then. And partly because of their class and their status, they get away with it. They're not under suspicion, but they're able to do things. But for example, I love this story, and as it happens, this character himself had a kind of intermittent faith, but his faith grew more solid as the Nazi years went on, and that is this man Otto Kiep, who was a diplomat, had been a real star of the diplomatic corps and landed one of the plum jobs in diplomacy, where he was appointed as consul general in New York City for Germany before Hitler, for the Weimar Republic. They sent him there, and he was living this wonderful life of a kind of Great Gatsby lifestyle of parties on Long Island and long weekends of swimming and sailing, and with some of those rich Long Island families in the late 20s and early 30s. You can imagine. He suddenly discovers at the end of January 1933 that he's now working for a new boss. I mean, the Nazis have taken over, and now his boss is Adolf Hitler. And he's just getting his bearings on that when this invitation arrives to attend a fundraising banquet at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. And it's a joint fundraiser for two Jewish charities who, again, by the way, as if to confirm that they didn't know what this new thing was, thought it was perfectly normal to invite the German consul, or German representative, to a Jewish event. They hadn't clocked, hadn't dawned on them yet quite how anti-Jewish this new regime is in Germany. But they invite Otto Kiep to this banquet, which is in honor of a man who at that point was certainly the world's most famous scientist, probably one of the most famous Germans, and certainly the world's most famous Jew. And that is Professor Albert Einstein. And they invite him to attend this dinner. And he looks at this invitation and thinks, if I go to this, I am defying my new masters in Berlin and surely ending my career. But if I don't go, I am as bad as they are. I will be shunning a fellow German just because of who he is. And he has that decision to make incredibly early. It's weeks into it in 1933. And the decision he makes sets him on a path to that gathering a decade later in 1943. So these moments come at different times for different people, but they do come with clarity. But you have to be yourself able to determine this is the moment. There won't be sort of church bells ringing or neon lights lit up, or signs lit up. You yourself have to realize this is the moment. This is the test. And he realized it the moment he looked at that invitation. But maybe some people would have just thought, Wednesday, I can't make it. Put it to one side. He understood how important the moment was.
Yeah, that's true. So, okay, I kind of have a personal question, and you can answer this if you want to or not, because you're religiously Jewish. I assume you don't believe in the resurrection and Jesus. Was that a fair assumption here?
That is a fair assumption. And even your point about religiously Jewish, Jews are like me, are complicated because they're often orthodox in practice, even if we're uncertain in our belief. So I'm always a bit sort of uncertain is the right word. I would sort of tick the undecided box often on the big questions of theological belief, but I'm very committed to Jewish practice for all kinds of reasons which we could get into. But no, the Christian principles of resurrection belief, no, those are not my. It's not my faith.
So when you read about these people, especially the ones who were convicted mostly because of their belief in Jesus and the fact that they felt like maybe the Nazi regime is watching, but somebody bigger is watching and more important. Yes. What does that make you think about Jesus? From my perspective, I've been a Christian my whole life. So I'm like, yeah, this is what it means to be a Christian. You do what's right regardless of like I've been embedded in the whole Christian thing my whole life, so I don't know what it's like for somebody who doesn't believe in the core tenets of Christianity. Like when you look at people like that, there's obviously something different about them. Like what do you think and feel about that?
Well, I have great admiration for their actions, but also for their faith. I see that now. I don't think I did before, as a protection, as a defense against tyranny. I'm not sure I understood that before, but I now admire the fact they do believe in a higher authority. They believe in the, I hope this doesn't sound now like I'm being the sort of postmodern with my truth, but they believe in the higher authority that they were raised with and that they hold to. People of other faiths would believe in the higher authority they hold to. And I mentioned there were some for whom it was their aristocratic lineage, but the function was the same, which meant it ensured they did not bestow a kind of supremacy on Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich. That's the key move, as far as I'm concerned, to not see a human regime as the ultimate arbiter of right and wrong. And whichever way you make to that route you take to that path will depend on culture and upbringing and family and tradition. And, you know, for you, it's Christianity. For me, it's Judaism. That's because those are functions of where we're born. But in a way, that the deeper principle, the one I think you and I would have in common, would be this notion that there is a higher authority than just the sort of official governmental authority of the day. The more difficult thing, and I hope this isn't uncomfortable for people listening to this, because the key takeaway that I would want them to come away is that I have come away from this whole process with enhanced respect for conviction Christianity. But the sort of more ticklish and uncomfortable fact is there will have been a lot of people who went along with the Holocaust who thought of themselves as Christians too. And I mentioned before that book I wrote called The Escape Artist. As it turned out, and I didn't know this, I just checked the calendar, the day that the 19-year-old hero of that story, Rudolf Werber, alongside a fellow Jew, Fred Wetzler. Joseph was the nom de guerre he gave himself later. Rudolf Werber and Fred Wetzler escaped in April 1944, and I went back to the calendar. They did not know that the night they escaped was the first night of Passover, a festival about escaping slavery for freedom. But it was also Good Friday. And that day, there were SS men who were in church for Good Friday. SS men whose day jobs were running the death camp of Auschwitz. Who took time off because it was Good Friday, you know, got themselves signed off from their shift or whatever, to be in church on Good Friday. Now, that is challenging for all of us. But I would say, you know, it's challenging for Christians. It must be, especially, to know that. And that's why I can't come away from the stories I tell in the Traitors Circle and go, well, that's it then. As long as you're a conviction Christian, you're always going to do the right thing. Because unfortunately, it doesn't. The evidence doesn't fall that way in terms of this particular period, even though in my group of people, it's really striking to me that they, you know, conviction Christians are represented heroically in the without giving anything away in this story.
It's interesting because this is something that I've been trying to think about for a couple of years now, just with like what we talked about at the beginning of this conversation, the moral relativism of our time and the fact that we live in just a more globalized world, which means that certain cultural traditions and things like that erode. You know, my wife and I were actually just talking about how, like, even the foods we eat, I don't even know where they come from, or like we don't have traditions of foods that we eat. Like I'm like German, Irish. I have all these different ancestors and people who got married in the United States because it's a melting pot. So does my wife. And so, you know, the Germans and the English and the Scots, they all used to have all of these different traditions, and whether that be food or whether that be holidays and how they did things. And a lot of that, for better or for worse, has been lost in the melting pot of America and in the fact that the world feels a lot smaller now because of communication and things like that. And with that, you lose some of what some of these people were convicted because of their ancestors. There was just like, your name means something,
Yes.
and you want to honor your father and your mother. You want to honor your lineage because you're not here without them. There's much more detachment from that. People move away from their families now. Some people talk to their parents like twice a year. And so that wouldn't have happened throughout almost all of human history. How do you, I don't even know if it's possible anymore, but how do you build back some of that? Because whether your conviction is on the level of looking back to your ancestors and saying, I want to honor that, or whether it's on the level of God exists and I'm going to be judged by him. Like both of those things are good. And if they can both help resist tyranny, whenever that comes, you would want to maybe preserve that. And it doesn't feel like the West has done a very good job of preserving that, and from my perspective.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I had not thought about the family ties because I had thought of those family ties as sort of peculiar to a very narrow, small, landed aristocratic class where you've got a family tree that goes back 6 centuries. That most people don't have that, and they have records and documents because they were the big family in the county, and therefore their records were good. Most of us don't have that, but I think the aspiration that in a way you're articulating, I think is an appropriate one, and one we should aim for, and that is that people, I can't help but sort of reach for the word community. And again, as things that I admire about religious life, the sense of community and sort of kinship, certainly with others in your community, but even with your own forebears, is something religious communities do very, very well. So I mentioned before that even if I am, intermittent or uncertain about the traditional understanding of faith, what I definitely do know is that it's good and has been good for me and my children and others I see around me to be embedded in a Jewish community, which in most cases, not in all, but in most cases ends up being a religious community. So, I go to synagogue and have no problem going to synagogue with whatever my ins and outs on faith are, because I'm standing there with others in the knowledge that my father would have done the same, my grandfather would have done the same, my great-grandfather would have done the same, his father would have done the same, in wherever we were in the world. And that all of that serves as a kind of bulwark against the forces that go the other way, which I think you were talking in some ways about globalization and modernization.
Sure. Yeah.
Which can often sort of make us these quite atomized individuals who are sort of bombarding around the universe with no sense of anchor and roots. And so I'm big on it and feeling anchored and feeling rooted. And for many, many people, the path to that is through a religious community, and I have huge respect for that. And very often I look around and I see good deeds being done, for refugees or for the poor or for the homeless. And, chances are it'll be a religious community doing it. And, I'm just, whether I have that religious faith or not, it is really secondary. The truth is religious communities play a role very often at the forefront of social responsibility, and we saw it in your own country in the civil rights era and so on. It's just those are these examples. It's not hard and fast, because we can also find religious people on the other side of these arguments, and we know that too. But I think it may be one of those things that's necessary, even if it is not sufficient.
Yeah, it's interesting that what you're saying. You talk about your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, all engaged in the same traditions and same religious practices. And obviously it just reminds me of the 10 Commandments: honor your mother and your father. There's that feels to be like embedded in whatever that is. It's like, okay, yeah, maybe I don't fully understand what's going on, or I don't exactly believe every little thing here, but at the very least, it's good to recognize the fact that our parents and our grandparents and our great grandparents had some wisdom, so they weren't just doing this stuff for no reason. And it's because I grew up, in the United States here, like in Madison, which is really, really progressive. So there's this attitude that the people who've come before you are inadequate, not very smart, and your job is to break away from the restraints of whatever the past has put on you. And I disagree with that 100%. I don't think that that's our job, unless the things of the past are like totally evil. But we shouldn't just break away from things just for the sake of breaking away from things, which I think what a lot of people do, which is sort of a Rousseauian worldview. But that's what I was brought up in. And so it's very confusing then when people say, well, you should go back to church and things like that for young people, because they're like, wait, I grew up hearing, why would I go back to church? We've evolved past that.
Yes.
But I think we're learning right now, like you're saying, that actually maybe you can't evolve past that. Maybe
or shouldn't. I mean, it's really first of all, I work for a extremely progressive newspaper, the Guardian newspaper, and so the world you're describing, I'm very familiar with that, with the idea that we should always reinvent things from scratch, and the sort of cultural impulse which says if it's the past, that also means past as synonym for out of date, no longer applicable, and so on. No, I was just thinking slightly flippantly. The time I really think this is whenever you go to a wedding ceremony where the couple have decided to redo the ritual, and they're going to reinvent, they're going to write their own vows and all of that stuff. And I've lost count of the number of times I've turned to my wife as some really quite hokey and poorly written vows are being spoken, and I will turn to my wife and say, there's a reason why our forebears just stuck with it, because they kind of worked it out. I mean, they got it right. They had thousands of years of honing this thing. A Jewish wedding being an example. A Jewish wedding ceremony is a beautiful thing. It's gone through generations of refinement and honing. It was pretty good. You don't need to redo it and do it again with your own sort of pick and mix approach and drawing here and there. Our elders, there were some things they got right, and so I do think with the something like a wedding ceremony, that's where I would be. Even though I do consider my politics in some ways progressive on those sorts of cultural things, these things hung around for thousands of years for a reason, which is because they were often very, very effective.
And they added a reverence and a meaning. I totally agree. And I'm not old, so sometimes I feel like I sound like an old, like angry, like we should do it the old way. But like I go to weddings sometimes too, and people their wedding vows are they feel trivial to me, and it's like, are you sure that's gonna last the whole marriage? Like, is that gonna last like 50 years? I don't know. And so like when we got married, the pastor that married us, he was like, I don't let people write their own vows. So we do it the way that it's been done, and I actually really appreciated that because because one, there's the lineage of it, there's the heritage of it, and then there's also the higher power. So those two things coming together in marriage. So I want to ask a question, maybe to wrap things up. And this is like, by the way, I don't know where this is going to go, and it has less to do with the book, but it has to do with World War II. And I think that it's an interesting question, and one that many people, including the Tucker Carlsons of the world, have continually been bringing up, is the fact that he thinks, and a lot of people on the right nowadays, and I don't know why, think that the whole Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb, that was all objectively evil. We should have never done that. I don't know if you've heard him say this, and it's something that I've thought about. And I know that you've written on World War II. I'm sure, I don't know, maybe you have opinions on the atomic bomb. The Oppenheimer movie came out a couple of years ago, which I thought was fantastic. And so, maybe, like, what are your thoughts on the atomic bomb? Obviously, it was a tragedy. It's not a good thing. We don't look back at that and say, wow, that was amazing that had to happen. No. On the other hand, it was, to me, I look at that and I think that was one of the greatest triumphs of Western civilization in the face of tyranny. I can't think of another example. The Revolutionary War, I don't know. Like, what do you think about the atomic bomb, and how should people think about that event?
And just explain to me your feeling about why it's one of the great triumphs of Western civilization? In what sense do you mean that?
What I mean is, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. What I mean is, like, the fact that, from my understanding, is that the Nazis were also trying to build a bomb.
Yes.
And in my opinion, if the Nazis would have gotten anything that even was remotely close to an atomic bomb, it basically would have been over for everybody.
Yes.
And that would have caused just tragedy for God knows how long for millions and millions and billions of people. So to me, it was a net positive if we want to look at it that way. In like the mathematical terms, there's a net positive in terms of, and also on the other hand, I think the Japanese had refused to surrender. So they were just going to sacrifice everybody. And so when I look at that, I think to myself, okay, it was a race against time. It was the United States versus the Nazis. The Nazis had the better scientists, but a lot of those scientists were Jewish. And so Oppenheimer in the movie, he says we have an advantage, which is anti-Semitism. Hitler might not give them the resources that they need to make the bomb, which is just totally fascinating. And,
Yes.
And so when I look at that whole situation, one, I just think of like, I feel like it was God's providence, the whole way that it worked out. But two, like, had we not made the bomb, I think things would be way worse. And
yes. Well, that last point is in a way where I finally land, which is, I think, and it's so difficult because I'm uncomfortable with strictly or especially numerically utilitarian arguments where you literally add a number of lives in one column against them. Partly because I think where both you and I would be from our respective traditions is that every life has great value and every life is in the image of God, a phrase I use even if I am a waverer on traditional religious belief.
Totally.
So it's hard for me to, that's why I pushed you on the language of describing it as a great triumph for Western civilization, because it's hard to feel that. And yet it is clear to me that had the bomb not been dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it is very probable that the war in the Pacific would have continued and it would have cost, expended, taken even more lives than were lost in both those two cities. That this would have been a war, just judging by what had gone before, that would have taken millions of dead and would have continued. And therefore it did, the finality that was demanded then, it did deliver that. And but it's choosing between two evils. I mean, the evil of the tens of thousands killed in a flash in Hiroshima, the evil of the tens of thousands killed and wounded and scarred and burnt in Nagasaki is set against the evil of a war in the Pacific that would have continued and continued and continued. So you're choosing between different forms of horror, and that's always extremely hard. I think your point about the race is interesting because, of course, by then the Nazis had unconditionally surrendered. That was over. They had lost that race.
Right. It's true. Yeah.
But that it's sort of easy for me to say that. But you needed the Americans and the Manhattan Project to be in that race. Otherwise, eventually the Germans would have got there. As it were.
Right.
Or at least there was a possibility of that. I mean, it is quite true. And it's even at some point mentioned actually in this book, in the Traitors Circle, this sort of rumor that goes around that the Germans are developing a secret weapon. And so, there is a sort of providence there that just a few moments of key forks in the road opened up whereby the Germans did not get the bomb and the Allies did. And, we can own, as you said, I mean, even the possibility of that is too awful to contemplate. A regime that had no compunction about hunting down children and the elderly in every corner of Europe to make sure they eradicated every last Jew, they would have used surely the nuclear bomb without any hesitation for whatever evil ends they had in mind. So the other thing as well that goes to your side of the argument is the fact that it has acted as some kind of deterrent, that there have of course have been wars since 1945, but those wars have been fought within some kinds of limits, certainly in Europe and elsewhere. that perhaps would not have applied had that bomb not been invented. But we're choosing, as I say, between degrees of
Right.
Of things that are unpalatable.
Right. I totally agree. And it's weird that when I just think about the fact that I've grown up in a nuclear world, and a lot of people did grow up in a nuclear world. That was never hanging in the back of their mind. Like, wait a second, we have thousands of nuclear warheads across this earth. Rival countries have them, and like, hopefully nobody does anything.
Yeah.
It's like, but like, Lord, please don't let anybody do anything. Yeah, wow. There's so much to talk about with World War II, and I personally, I think it's one of the most important historical events that people should just continue to contemplate, as I try to, because of there's such a moral depth to it, like you talked about. I suppose people should buy the book, The Traitors Circle, read it, contemplate, figure out what sort of bearing this historical event actually has in our lives today. Like, what would you say, I guess, to conclude about World War II and why people should continue to read books about this war that happened, feels like so long ago?
Yeah. I think it serves as a source of great moral instruction whose relevance not only has not faded in 80 years, but to me seems to only get more, it could become more sharp, more intense, more resonant for now. We live in an age where in different places in the world, I'm not making a narrow point here. Mm-hmm. There are people making moves towards autocracy and tyranny, that human impulse that you mentioned that is there in the Bible, people wanting kings, and no shortage of people stepping forward to become that person and exercise absolute power, and people turning on their neighbors and dividing against them and closing their doors and imagining inflicting great pain on others. All of those things are in our world now. And to learn from those people who were confronted in the most pressing, sharp, vivid way with the question, what do you do now? What can one person do when confronted with the prospect of evil? That we can draw from that. We should, the sheer extremism of the example that the Second World War presents gives a kind of clear, sharp light through which to look at these decisions, which in different forms do recur down the generations and in different places. And I'm particularly glad you and I have had this conversation, Andy, because I do think that there's something in this story that Christians can look on with great pride, but also to learn from as a kind of inspiration. There are Christians who behave in this book in a way different from other Christians. And I hope they can look at this story and think, okay, there is a lesson there for how people of conviction need to behave when tested in the most extreme way. They faced life and death choices of good versus evil. And we can learn from the choices they eventually made.
Well, Jonathan, thanks. Seriously, thanks for this conversation. I think this is fantastic. People should absolutely buy the book, Traitors Circle. I'll put a link in the description and all of that, because it's a fascinating book and it's a very important book. And it's timely. Like, these issues that you talk about in the book are exactly the issues that we face today in a lot of ways. So thank you so much. I really appreciate you talking.
Thank you, Andy. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.